Part 4, Glockenspiel. The Glockenspiel somewhat is to the vibraphone as the xylophone was to the marimba. Higher in pitch, brighter in tone quality. Major difference, however, the keys of the Glockenspiel are steel alloy, whereas the keys for the vibraphone are an aluminum alloy. So you get a very different tone quality. Give me just a moment. You get a very different tone quality on the vibraphone than you do on the Glockenspiel. And so on the Glockenspiel, you use significantly harder mallets than you do on the vibraphone. The Glockenspiel mallets are actually too hard and sound very glassy on the vibraphone. The vibraphone is very, very rarely, if at all, if ever, played with unwrapped. It's almost exclusively played with yarn or cord wrapped mallets. The Glockenspiel, on the other hand, almost never played with yarn mallets, almost always with plastic, and even harder plastic than we had on the xylophone. The soft plastic mallets from the xylophone start to sound pretty soft in the highest register of the Glockenspiel. So we go to an even harder plastic for the Glockenspiel. And sometimes we'll even use a metal mallet if we want a really hard and brittle sound. However, it's important to note that these are brass mallets, brass being a very soft metal, the steel of the Glockenspiel bars being a very hard metal, so it's not possible to damage, to scratch, or dent the Glockenspiel bars with the brass mallets. We need to use a soft metal. But you can hear how brilliant the sound compared to the plastic. So usually what I do, also, there's no pedal, and it rings forever. So we need to stop the sound with our hands, with our fingers. Very occasionally I'll use finger dampening on the Glockenspiel to stop it rather than letting them all ring. If I need a little bit more clarity, but most often I just let the instrument ring and then stop it. Sometimes with the entire arm, you can hear I didn't quite get all the notes damped. If I need to completely stop it, I'll use my forearms. The range of the Glockenspiel is fairly standard. It's the G below middle C to the C 2 octaves above. However, the sounding pitch on the high C is the same as the high pitch was on the xylophone. It's the same as the highest pitch on the piano. It actually sounds 8 ledger lines above the treble staff. The issue with the Glockenspiel, the entire instrument is pitched above the staff. If this is 8 ledger lines, 5 ledger lines, 2 ledger lines, the lowest note of the instrument, the G, sounds the G on top of the treble staff. So the Glockenspiel is written, as you can see on the chart, transposing 2 octaves above written pitch. So the lowest C is written middle C, sounds 2 ledger lines above the staff. The lowest G is written below the treble staff, sounds above the treble staff. The highest note of the Glockenspiel is written as the 2 ledger line C. Again, the entire instrument sounds 2 octaves above written pitch. It can be very confusing. However, it's even more confusing. I had a composer once, I was ready to kill him, wrote the Glockenspiel at sounding pitch with all of those ledger lines. I'm pretty good with ledger lines, but even I had to write down the names of the notes between the 6 ledger line note and the 7 ledger line note. That was a little bit ridiculous. So there was only one composer that ever did that, but he drove me nuts. So remember the transposition on your Glockenspiel. Another issue with the range, before I get there, the Glockenspiel, as you see on the chart, does have an extended range instrument. The most common is going to F, one whole step lower, and going to D up in dog ear range above the highest note of the piano. I've never seen a part written for that note, but for some reason they decided to put it on there. One of our glockenspiels actually two of our glockenspiels, I take that back. All three of our glockenspiels, a TCNJ, are the extended range model. We used to have a smaller one, and it disappeared one year. So anyway, now we have three extended range glockenspiels. This my personal glockenspiel is the standard range, G to C. The other issue that there is with glockenspiel range is that the glockenspiel was originally written as a keyboard instrument, similar to the celeste. And many famous glockenspiel parts, beginning with Papageno's glockenspiel in the Magic Flute, were written for the keyboard glockenspiel, which has a larger range than the orchestral glockenspiel. It goes significantly lower, down to another C below written bass clef C, again sounding octave above middle C. And so some of those parts, especially Magic Flute, for instance, is beyond the range of a standard glockenspiel. There are parts that are very challenging for the orchestral glockenspiel to play with mallets, because they were intended to be played with fingers. There's a famous part in Sorcerer's Apprentice that just goes nuts for the glockenspiel player. And was just designed for a pianist to go tiddly-dum, 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 tiddly-dum. So that's something to keep in mind. You will encounter range issues with classical and romantic period glockenspiel parts. For some reason, the keyboard glockenspiel went out of favor around the turn of the 20th century, and anything early 20th century forward was intended to be played on the orchestral glockenspiel. So that's another issue. Another range issue is that a lot of composers do not understand the transposition, and they write one octave when they really mean a higher octave. And so sometimes I will actually edit glockenspiel parts if it just doesn't sound right in the octave that it's notated. So I will occasionally transpose octaves on the glockenspiel, even if it's not completely necessary, just for the sound quality. And as I said, we were talking about the marimba. It is very, very common to simply transpose octaves on keyboard percussion parts. So if you get the part for the Magic Flute, for instance, or there's a famous part from Debussy, La Mer, that calls for glockenspiel, keyboard glockenspiel below the range of the orchestral glockenspiel. And we simply transpose it. For whatever reason, they decided never to use orchestral keyboard glockenspiels. And I've only seen one like once or twice. Very strange historical perspective, but that's what we deal with sometimes. So we talked about the mallets. Again, for me, the default setting is the plastic. And when I need to go brighter and more brilliant is when I switch to the metal, to the brass. Occasionally I'll use a soft mallet, but I usually find that it sounds better to play softly with the standard mallet than to get too soft a tone quality. Occasionally we'll go to a softer mallet, not too soft. That's one issue. We talked about muffling the glockenspiel. We talked about the various mallets. This ends part 4. You need to reset for part 5 for crotales. See you in a few minutes.